Hello, John Urquhart, The Wonders of Prophecy. This time talking about Egypt, and this time specifically on the rivers and the canals of Egypt. We've talked about two of the great cities, the two great capitals, that is Thebes and Noph, or Memphis, in the two previous videos. This time, the rivers and canals of Egypt. We turn once more to the general aspect and fortunes of the entire country. The hand of decay was also to be placed upon the rivers and the canals. We read, I will make the rivers dry. That's Ezekiel 30, verse 12. And again, the waters shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and become dry. And the rivers shall stink. The streams or canals of Egypt shall be minished and dried up. Isaiah 19, 5 and 6. By the sea is in all probability meant the Nile. It was named Oceanos by Homer, and has been called the sea, or the Sea of the Nile, by both ancient and modern Egyptians. The rivers, which were to become dry and to stink, were the arms of the Nile, which passed through the plain of the delta, poured the waters of this gigantic stream into the Mediterranean. Part of this prediction is as yet unfulfilled. The waters have not as yet failed from the sea, but nevertheless we trace even here fulfillments as wonderful as those which startle us in other parts of the prophetic description. The hand of decay has made a deepening impress on the rivers and the canals of Egypt. In his article on the Nile in Smith's Bible Dictionary, Mr. Reginald Stuart Poole says, quote, the great difference between the Nile of Egypt in the present day and in ancient times is caused by the failure of some of its branches. The river was famous for its 7 branches, and under the Roman dominion 11 were counted, of which, however, there were but 7 principal ones. Herodotus notices that there were 7, of which he says that 2, the present Damietta and Rosetta branches, were originally artificial, and he therefore speaks of the 5 mouths. Now, as for a long period past, there are no navigable and unobstructed branches, but these 2 that Herodotus distinguishes as the work of man. That's the 2 that were constructed apparently by the Egyptians before the days of Herodotus, so at least 2,400 years ago. Even these are accessible only to small vessels. The 5 other ancient mouths of the river have long ago silted up, and their course can now be hardly traced over the great alluvial plain and through the network of canals and lakes which interpose between the sea and this point. This is all from Stuart Poole's book on Egypt. The rivers then have been made dry, and instead of flowing in their ancient course, they have become stinking pools and marshes. What had formerly ministered to health and pleasure was changed into a danger and an offense. For there can be no doubt that what is shown here in the vivid picture of prophecy was a condition through which they actually passed. Referring to one of the canals of Cairo, Wilkinson says that to close it and turn its bed into a street would have the advantage of freeing the houses on its banks from the noxious vapors that rise when the water has retired and left a bed of liquid mud. Urquhart says, what now of the canals? Amru, the Mohammedan conqueror of Egypt, wrote to the caliph that it was necessary that 1/3 of the entire revenues of the country should be devoted to the maintenance of the canals. This has never been done, and the result has been that the canals also have been minished and dried up, in the words of the King James. The predecessors of the present dynasty seem to have specially sinned in this respect. This is written, of course, around the turn of the last century, around 1900. The Mameluke Beys, says Malta-Brunn, applied to their own private use the funds destined to the support of these public works, of which the fertility of Egypt, or rather on which the fertility of Egypt depends. Many canals were even abandoned by these barbarians, who thus destroyed the sources of their own revenues. Mahomet Ali and Ismail Pasha have undoubtedly tried to atone for the neglect of the past. The resources of the country and the lives of her children have been lavished in the attempt to undo the mischief which has resulted from former negligence. But their efforts have been only partially successful. The Manufia Canal, for example, used formerly to communicate with the Rosetta branch of the Nile, but is now dammed up. Mr. Villiers Stuart, who was deputed to examine and report upon the state of Egypt in 1882, says, quote, "One complaint often made to me on the subject of irrigation in the delta is that the canals run dry at the critical season of the year, and when the quantity and quality of the cotton crop are most seriously affected by any deficiency of the water supply." Of the said, or Upper Egypt, he writes, "If, quote, there were a canal system as perfect as in the delta, it would far exceed it in richness of vegetation and in wealth-producing power," unquote. As it is at present, it depends for its one crop on the annual overflow of the Nile. Were a system of canal irrigation introduced, quote, "it could grow 3 crops where it grows now but 1," unquote. But is this a modern discovery? Did the wise Egyptians live for centuries in the country without suspecting that there was so easy a method of multiplying its fertility? No. This part of the country, now condemned to comparative barrenness and poverty for the lack of irrigation, was once covered with canals. The following extracts explain how the change has come about. Quote, "Canals exist, but many have been allowed to silt up. They all want deepening. They ought to be connected together as a scientific system. The shallowness of the canals is partly due to the fact that the late Khedive diverted to his sugar estates and to other purposes the forced labor that ought to have been applied to keep them clean. There seems no doubt that the ancient Egyptians kept the canals in Upper Egypt full. This accounts for the much larger population in the time of the pharaohs. We could irrigate our land much better," the peasant said to him, "and more of it if the canals had water in them, but they are dry. If they were deepened, there would be water in them always. The canals, as the scripture predicted, have been diminished and dried up." Another feature, third that is in his list of prophecies fulfilled, the river scenery. The river scenery of Egypt as presented in the prophetic picture indicated a further remarkable change. Mr. Reginald Stuart Poole, formerly of the British Museum, writes, "The monuments and the narratives of ancient writers show us, in the Nile of Egypt, in old times, a stream bordered by flags and reeds, the covert of abundant wildfowl, and bearing on its waters the fragrant flowers of the various colored lotus. Now, in Egypt, scarcely any reeds or water plants, the famous papyrus being nearly, if not quite, extinct, and the lotus almost unknown. Few plants, therefore, are to be seen except in the marshes near the Mediterranean. This also was prophesied by Isaiah. The papyrus breeds in the river, and everything growing, literally sown, in the river, shall be dried up, driven away by the wind, and shall not be." That's Isaiah 19, verse 7. When it is recollected that the water plants of Egypt were so abundant as to be a great source of revenue in the prophet's time, and much later, the exact fulfillment of his predictions is a valuable evidence of the truth of the old opinion as to the sure word of prophecy. This was indeed no small part of the burden of loss and decay, which was to lay the pride of Egypt in the dust. An inscription speaks of an Egyptian queen as having reigned over the land of the papyrus and the lotus. These plants formed so striking a feature of Upper and Lower Egypt, respectively, that they became the symbols of the districts. They were also a boon to the people and a source of considerable revenue to the crown. The lotus, the papyrus, and other similar productions of the land during and after the inundation were, for the poor, one of the greatest blessings nature ever provided for any people. They were largely used as food. The lotus flowers were in constant demand for the bouquets and garlands which the Egyptian host presented to, and which he adorned his guest. The seeds were pounded and made into bread. The papyrus was put to many uses. They employ the roots, Pliny writes, as firewood and for making various utensils. They even construct small boats of the plant, and out of the rind, sails, mats, clothes, bedding, and ropes. But that which made it famous, and which has preserved the name to our own time, was the use made of it as a writing material. Pliny, who wrote in the latter half of the 1st century of our era, describes the appearance and the growth of the plant and the various kinds of paper which were formed from it. We know that papyrus was in use till the 7th century, and until that time the plant was still found in its ancient home. But then, as now, it stood written, the reeds and the flags shall wither away. The meadow, here used as Gesenius, of the grassy places on the banks of the Nile, the meadow by the Nile, by the brink of the Nile, and all that is sown by the Nile shall become dry, be driven away, and be no more. Again, Isaiah 19, verses 6 and 7. And a day all is fulfilled. The plant is now unknown in Egypt. The pink and the blue lotus, which appear so frequently in the paintings, have also passed away. The traveler is struck by the absence of verdure on the Nile banks. It is a curious fact that no water plants or weeds grow on the banks of the Nile. A sedgy margin is never to be met with in this country. One traveler said, Rawlinson, that is, I think it's Rawlinson, one of the above cited travelers anyway, made that point, that it's quite a contrast with the monuments. Next time he's going to be talking about the fisheries. So here we go. This is number 4 in his list of the 10 predictions. A similar prediction is made regarding the fisheries. Herodotus says that a certain number of the poorer Egyptians lived almost entirely on fish. It was so abundant that it was necessarily cheap. The Nile produced several kinds which were easily caught. And in Lake Moeris, that is Moeris, the abundance of fish was such that the pharaohs are said to have derived from the sale a revenue above 94,000 pounds a year. The fishermen of Egypt formed a numerous class, and the salting and drying of fish furnished occupation to a large number of persons. Diodorus refers to the fisheries of Egypt in similar terms, showing that the industry, within 50 years of the beginning of the Christian era, had suffered no diminution. Fish constituted even then a large portion of the daily food of the people, and dried fish formed a large item in Egyptian exports. But it stood written, the fishers also shall lament, and all they that cast angle into the Nile shall mourn, and they that spread nets upon the waters shall languish. Isaiah 19, verse 8. And this too has been accomplished. In the decline of Egypt, the fish pools and their conduits were neglected and ruined, and the fishers lamented, mourned, and languished. Having once been very productive and a main source of revenue as well as of sustenance, the fisheries are now scarcely of any moment, excepting about Lake Menzala and in some few places elsewhere, chiefly in the north of Egypt. Next time, remaining industries of Egypt also dealt with quite thoroughly by Isaiah in chapter 19. I'll put in a link to Israel's worshipping Egypt's gods when still in slavery, and perhaps even before they entered into slavery in Egypt. This is a point in one of our Proclaimers videos, that we often miss this point, that God did not save a faithful people out of Egypt. He saved those who even before their slavery had entered into compromise by worship of the Egyptian deities. So says Ezekiel 20. So we've made a video about that in our Proclaimers series and playlist. I'll put the playlist as well as that video on your screen. See you next time.